Aboriginal legends may not be as metaphorical as once thought. There's mounting evidence that some stories reveal clues about events from our ancient past and represent genuine and unique observations about our environment. Joining me to discuss is Dr Duane Hamacher, an astrophysicist at the University of New South Wales. Doctor, good morning.
Good morning.
Aboriginal stories often involve otherworldly elements. There's sky beings and devils. What is it about them that reveals our history?
Well, a lot of the oral traditions contain, all the oral traditions contain the information necessary for culture to survive. So it contains information about the natural world, and that's the kind of stuff that I'm really interested in. And it tells us a lot about natural events that have occurred in the past.
One legend describes the landing of a meteor in the central desert over 4,000 years ago. Can you tell us about this story and how it actually matches up with our historical records?
Yes, so what happened is about 4,500 years ago, give or take, this small asteroid came through the Earth's atmosphere and broke apart before it hit the ground, and it made about 13 or 14 impact craters ranging from 10 to 180 meters across. And back in the early 1900s, about the 1930s, it was quote-unquote discovered, rediscovered by white fellas, and, people had gone out there, geologists had gone out to investigate the site because they had heard about these big holes in the ground to see if they were from meteorites or something else. So a geologist from Adelaide named Madigan went out there and took some Aboriginal guides with him, some of the senior men out there, and to investigate the site. And the men refused to go near the craters. They said that that was where the fire devil had come from the sky and had run down and hit the ground and set the land on fire and killed everybody and created the big holes. And that they wouldn't, one of the craters would collect rainwater sometimes and get, actually referred to as a water crater. So they would not collect water from those craters because if they did, they feared the fire devil would fill them with a piece of iron again. And this wasn't just one individual. This is several individuals over the course of a few years out in the central desert. So it seems to record an event that occurred 4,000 or 5,000 years ago.
So was the stories able to be accurate date-wise? Was it able to tell us around when it happened according to their timeline?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's one of these things where it was handed down, over generations, so there wasn't exactly a timestamp on it. But we know that these traditions are accurate. They have to be accurate, or people wouldn't have survived for as long as they have. I mean, 50 or 60,000 years, the traditions have to be accurate. So it was interesting to pair up the oral traditions and the scientific data and show that they coincide very nicely. I mean, it's not as easy just to stick an error bar on an oral tradition as it is, when you're looking at physical data. But it's still quite fascinating to look and see how these oral traditions survive for such a very long time.
Is there a fear that people are only finding what they want to find when they do read into these stories? I imagine, asteroids probably hit Australia with more regularity than we might realise, especially over the course of thousands of years.
Well, they do. I mean, we have lots of scars of impact craters all across Australia, mostly out in the desert because there's not very much erosion to erase them. We don't know of any, for example, on the eastern coast at all, even though it's almost certain they've occurred. But there are hundreds of Aboriginal stories about objects falling out of the sky, hitting the ground, exploding in the atmosphere, causing death, fire, and destruction. But we only know of the actual physical scars of a handful of them, so I'm sure there's a whole lot more out there still waiting to be found.
We're joined by astrophysicist Dr Duane Hamacher from the University of New South Wales. You also travelled to Victoria last year with a tsunami expert to visit members of the Gunditj Mara people. I'm not sure there are too many tsunamis happening anytime soon in the middle of Victoria. What were you looking for there?
Well, the coast of Victoria is prone to tsunamis, not on a regular basis, but they do happen from time to time. It's also one of the most recently geological active areas of Australia. So just a few thousand years ago, you actually had active volcanoes down there, and there's lots of, volcanic cones and stuff in the region that people in Western Victoria would be quite familiar with. But we found this oral tradition that was recorded in the early 1800s, or mid-1800s, that talked about this gigantic wave that came rushing inland. And it killed all the people except those who were high on the mountaintops, the hilltops. And they started naming off all the different locations and describing in pretty good detail, what was going on. So we thought, maybe, we could find some evidence of this in the form of tsunami deposits. So Professor James Goff, who's a tsunami expert here at UNSW, he and I went out to Portland and met with some of the Gundjamara people and went around to a few places along the coast there, with about a kilometer inland, just to see what we could find. I mean, it hadn't been a full-on project yet, but just take some core samples and look. And every place we went, about 1.5 meters to 2 meters down, we found a pretty thick layer of ocean sediment, which was indicative of a tsunami occurring a few thousand years ago. The one thing about the story that was really cool is it said that when Mount Gambier begins burning again, the tsunami will come back. So it suggested a link between volcanic eruptions and the tsunami coming in. Of course, Mount Gambier hasn't erupted in a few thousand years. So again, another old tradition talking about natural events that would have occurred a few thousand years ago. Wow.
Well, academics sometimes struggle to communicate with Indigenous communities. Has this posed a challenge in your work?
Actually, I have more difficulty talking with some of the journalists than I do with the community. But no, for the most part, it depends on the way you do it. And of course, we work closely with a lot of Aboriginal communities, and it takes a long time to build up a proper trust and a rapport. So that's really critical.
75% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages are critically endangered. I imagine this poses a huge threat to this bank of knowledge that we do know. It's a huge history that might be lost.
Well, it absolutely is. I mean, this is one of the challenges. Is Aboriginal languages are dying. I mean, there are a lot of places where they're being revived. So there's a big movement. I mean, there's movements all across the country. I know here in New South Wales, the Wiradjuri language is making a big comeback now. But yeah, I mean, all these oral traditions are encoded in the language, and when the language is translated into English, you lose a lot of the context and stuff. So that becomes a challenge. And of course, when the language dies, or the first speakers of that language are gone, then you're having to rely on secondary and the third-hand accounts of stuff, and you lose a lot in that respect.
Have you got any more stories you're looking to have a look at in the next couple of months?
Oh, there's so many things we've been investigating. I mean, we're looking at Seven Sisters stories, Morning Star stories. We've been looking at things like eclipses and comets for a long time. So there's just tremendous wealth of knowledge about natural events and astronomical knowledge that we're investigating. We've got a pretty good team here, so we're getting a lot of stuff out there.
Doctor, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.